So thank you very much for this introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to speak at the British School of Athens. Of course, I would have loved to be in Athens for this, and as it is, I'm saying hello to everyone from a very chilly Swansea. And of course, as John has already said, I'm giving this paper because last year I had the privilege to be the BSA visiting fellow. Now, for a while, it wasn't even clear whether I would be able to visit at all. But in the end, I had 2 rather wonderful months in the library at the British School of Athens. And this was really like a haven after such a long time without libraries at all, and a real chance to make some progress with my research on the Peloponnesian League. And what I'm presenting today is work that I've been thinking about for some time, but last spring I finally had the chance to put it together more properly and to move into the 5th century as well, which plays a role in this interpretation as well. So, as an avid follower of the Herodotus Helpline seminars, also a virtual seminar series, I'm aware just how much is going on in Herodotus studies at the moment. The histories are being reassessed and studied from many different angles. The notion that we need to read Herodotus with his own 5th century background in mind is not exactly new at this stage. This makes it even more surprising, perhaps, that his Peloponnesian stories have not been reassessed in this context. The standard narrative of the rise of Sparta's power in the Peloponnese relies pretty much on Herodotus' outline, and it is quite surprising how little critique his account has received so far, unlike his discussion of Sparta's customs and constitution. In this paper, I'd like to give you an overview of my approach to the various passages in Herodotus which chart the rise of Sparta as leader of the Peloponnesians before the Persian Wars. I look at these passages in the light of what we know about the archaic Peloponnese in the 5th century and in the 5th century context of Herodotus' research. As a result, we get somewhat different model of Sparta, how part of Sparta really built its influence in the Peloponnese. This work illustrates the problems with some of the main historical narrative that was built in the 20th century by various scholars. I've tried to draw on as much alternative evidence as can be found, but of course Herodotus remains a major source of information for the archaic Peloponnese. So this study can only be a precarious balancing act in reinterpretation. On one hand, suggesting that we cannot trust him as much as people thought in the past, while still drawing on his account too. We'll see what you think about my way of squaring this particular circle. While some details of history we thought we know might be in doubt, there are new details to discover too. What I find most intriguing are glimpses of local versions of the past in the 5th century, contested histories provided to Herodotus by what seems like very different voices. We don't quite know when Herodotus was gathering much of his evidence. The 450s are a plausible starting point. The work was finished at some point during the Peloponnesian War. The early 420s is the traditional date, but it may have been sometime later. This means that throughout Herodotus' adult life, the power of Athens was given, and Sparta soon became the main opponent. The Persian Wars were not just an important event in Greek history, they also had an important role in shaping the dominant power blocks of Herodotus' lifetime. And the politics of this polarization increasingly played out in city-states around the Aegean. Herodotus' Peloponnesian history has to be read in this context. But the aftermath of the Persian Wars initially saw a weakening of Sparta's influence, with prolonged succession crises in both royal families. Many old connections may have been lost. At any rate, there was a crisis of leadership. States which had been allied with Sparta by the time of the Persian Wars built their own networks, while Argos also tried to gain new influence. Then Sparta was hit by a major earthquake, followed by a Helot revolt in Messenia that was an existential threat. Following the shock, Sparta began to rebuild its influence in the Peloponnese. That's at least how I like to see it. I think that a more formal alliance, a league with procedures for collective action and with formal treaties, was probably only put in place at that point in the mid-5th century, a bit later even. The traditions Herodotus collected and the concerns of his narrative need to be seen in this context. The past is always a resource that will adapt to present needs, especially perhaps in times when interstate relations were undergoing complex changes. So Herodotus' story of Sparta's rising power has to be pieced together from various passages, which often digress from the main narrative, including flashbacks and stories presented as speeches. But there is a foundation story of the Peloponnesians and their allies, and this makes good narrative sense, since Sparta and its allies play such an important role in the story of how some Greek states came together to mount a defense against Xerxes' invasion of 480-79. In good Herodotian fashion, this is embedded in the story of Croesus, king of Lydia. The king is looking for allies in mainland Greece and wants to find out about the most powerful states. This section could be titled, Meanwhile, Back in Athens and Sparta. And it's from 156 to 68, 12 very dense chapters. We hear how Athens ended up with its tyrant Pisistratus, and then Herodotus moves on to Sparta. He tells how they got a new constitution under Lycurgus, which led to new prosperity and ambitions. The next step is an attack on Tegea, which leads to dominance in the Peloponnese. This means that King Croesus concludes that Sparta was the best candidate for an alliance. I'll come back to Tegea in a moment, but we need to stop here and consider this focus on Athens and Sparta. If you had to pick out the most influential states in mainland Greece in the mid-6th century, I'm not sure whether these two would have been the obvious choice. Don't get me wrong, both were big, prosperous states, especially Sparta, but I'm not convinced that contemporaries would have singled out these two in the same way. In the Peloponnese alone, Corinth and Argos were important too, and I'm increasingly convinced that Elis played a much more important role than it is usually given credit for. Singling out these two states makes better sense as the background story for the interstate politics which dominated Herodotus' own time. Before we go to the beginnings of the Peloponnesian League, it's worth considering how Herodotus thought Sparta began to build its power. A standard history today would start with the conquest of Messenia, but Herodotus doesn't deal with this at all. Messenia is hardly mentioned in his work. We get a few references to the Helot revolt of the 5th century, but Herodotus has no interest in investigating how the Spartans came to control this large part of the Peloponnese in the first place. Helots appear more often, almost exclusively as part of Spartan armies, without specific links to conquered Messenia. That's fair enough. These forces were presumably Laconians and Messenians, and for outsiders at least, distinguished by status more than geography. The myth-making and building of a distinct Messenian identity, which probably started with the Helot revolt in the 5th century, is not reflected at all. Not yet, at any rate, in Herodotus. The crucial conflict of Herodotus' early Peloponnese is in fact between Sparta and Argos. When Croesus finally needs help, Sparta isn't able to deliver because of a conflict with Argos over control of the Thyreatis on the east coast of the Peloponnese. A conflict between the two states in this region and around that time is quite plausible. Both have been slowly extending their influence along the coast for a while, especially Sparta going north along the coast. Herodotus suggests that the battle was actually part of a long fight, where Argos started out with control of the whole east coast, all the way down to the southern tip of Laconia, and including the island of Cythera, which isn't on my map. And that Argos was then only slowly pushed back, pretty much over generations, by the Spartans as they expanded north. Now, this isn't at all realistic. If we look at any kind of archaeological evidence, there's some Argive connections along that coast, but it's very unlikely that they managed to control any were near such a large territory at any given point. That would be very early and perhaps geometric period in our terms. So this is really not a realistic view of the early past. And so the situation in 5th century Argos is much more relevant to this, because in the 470s and 460s, Argos suffered from very serious civil unrest. These events clearly made an impression. Herodotus offers quite a few details, even though these events happened well after his main narrative ends. Now, this is one of the excuses for including this story, is that the dispute the Argives had with each other was about a catastrophe they'd suffered a generation earlier. Herodotus tells us that the Spartan king Cleomenes had inflicted a devastating defeat on Argos, killing thousands of Argive troops, perhaps in 494, if we want to date this event. Again, there are lots of details in this narrative that are problematic, but at any rate, in the 470s and 460s, the Argives seem to have remembered that there were different groups of citizens, some which had been enfranchised after this catastrophe, and that group was actually labeled as former slaves. This is probably more early 5th century rhetoric than actual historical fact. But in any case, these former slaves who'd gained citizen rights now found their citizen status questioned. And so we have very serious civil unrest in Argos. And of course, hand in hand with this, we have to assume is a reassessment of what actually happened in the past. But Argos was also at this time asserting its influence in the region. Mycenae and Tiryns were conquered, certainly by the end of the 460s, and their populations were displaced. Argos also then tried to assert influence in the wider Peloponnese, probably mainly by supporting states which aimed to assert independence from Spartan influence. Argos' reconstruction of its influence seems to have gone hand in hand with reconstruction of its past too. Argos began to appropriate the grand Homeric past of Mycenae, a development that soon influenced drama in mostly friendly Athens. The idea that Argos was a great Peloponnesian power before Sparta encroached on its territory is rooted in the Iliad too, and it's basically appropriating some of the information we get in the catalogue of ships. Other grand stories about influence beyond the Argolid are later linked to the elusive figure of Phaedon of Argos, who I personally think was probably pretty much completely an invention. Phaedon also turns up in Herodotus as the father of one of the suitors of Agariste, who allegedly took control of Olympia and made weights and measures for the Peloponnesians. Like the rest of the traditions about Phaedon, this does not stand up to scrutiny, and people have tried very hard. The grand Argive past is much more evident in later texts, but Herodotus shows that the basic stories about Argos as a large power in the early Peloponnese were taking shape at this point already, and that they were important enough to end up in his narrative. Now, let's go back to the foundation of story of the League and to Tegea. The actual foundation story revolves around this place. And this is perhaps the best example of 5th century tradition intruding into the narrative, because we have quite a few very specific details, which is striking because Tegea is a comparatively small player. And nevertheless, it seems that it was its perspective of some of these events that influenced Herodotus's narrative. So we are now back to the point where Croesus tries to find out which states in mainland Greece might be worthwhile allies. And Herodotus gives us a quick overview of how Athens and Sparta had developed up to that point, roughly in the mid-6th century in our terms. So following the reform of their constitution, the Spartans are feeling ambitious and asks the Oracle of Delphi about a conquest of Arcadia. They get a typically deceptive oracle, which suggests that Arcadia is too much, but which nevertheless seems to promise at least the conquest of Tegean land. The result is that the Tegeans beat the Spartans and make them work the field, using chains that they had themselves brought for the prisoners they hoped to make. This detail matters, since those chains were hanging in the temple of Athena Alea. Herodotus tells us about them. If he didn't see them himself, which isn't impossible, then he at least talked to someone who found that this was an important detail to convey. The whole narrative is actually quite disjointed. Apart from the relics in the temple, this Tegean victory doesn't have consequences, because Herodotus tells us the conflict continues with no major breakthrough on either side. In the end, another oracle tells the Spartans to fetch the bones of Orestes from Tegea. The Tegeans are not actually aware of this tomb, and finding the burial site is what makes the task especially difficult. In the end, the bones are discovered and taken away in secret. And then Herodotus finishes off the whole episode with this. Ever since then, the Spartans were far superior to the Tegeans whenever they met each other in battle. By the time of Croesus' inquiry, the Spartans had subdued most of the Peloponnese. And one should also say katestramene is the word he's using for subdued, and this is a pretty brutal word of subjection of territory or people. What's interesting is the story really jumps from they've now got the bones and now they're the leaders. We don't actually know what the process is between this little magical device and actually subjecting the Peloponnese. So what is going on here? I should say that Tegea was probably on reasonably good terms with Sparta soon after the mid-6th century. Around this time, Sparta probably took control of the Tiriatis, Tegea's access to the sea. Some kind of arrangements would probably have been useful for both sides. Soon after, the Tegeans founded a new urban center too, probably also a sign that they felt reasonably secure. But Herodotus' story is peculiar, and I think that it reflects a Tegean view of the past in Herodotus' own time. We know that soon after the Persian Wars, Tegea tried to distance itself from Sparta. And yes, pretty much all of that we know from the one passage of Herodotus that's on my screen now. In the middle decades of the 5th century, there is a period when Akkadian identity generally was first politicized, as far as we can tell, and probably mainly in opposition to Sparta. There was no Akkadian state or formal Akkadian League or anything of that kind, but someone produced a large series of coins labeled Akkadikon. Tegea was almost certainly involved in this. And in this context, where Tegea may even have led an Akkadian coalition into war with Sparta, possibly even twice if we follow Herodotus 935, then the idea of Tegea as the last bastion against Spartan domination makes very good sense. Herodotus documents another Tegean story, where yet again it is a Tegean, the mythical king Echemos, who defeats Hyllus, son of Heracles, at the Isthmus and prevents the first attempt of the Heraclidae to return to the Peloponnese. These are the Heraclidae, which were the ancestors of the Dorian Spartans. For an Acadian, of course, these Dorians were mere latecomers. So Herodotus' Tegean stories represent a fine balancing act between the spirit of Acadian resistance and important Persian war achievements on the side of Sparta. In its 5th century context, the story of Tegea as the pivotal city that had to be overcome by magical means to open control of the whole Peloponnese, particularly as the bastion against Spartan domination of Arcadia, makes good sense. But this also means it doesn't tell us much about how the Peloponnesian League really started. Now, it seems much more likely, actually, that Sparta's alliances were built on complex networks with many states, gradually increasing friendships rather than conquest. And it is unlikely that beyond Messenia, there was actually any one region that needed to be overcome with violence. And we also have to think that this building of a network was probably not aiming for, at least not initially, for territorial integrity. They weren't building from southern Arcadia outwards into the rest of the Peloponnese. We probably have opportunistic relationships wherever they occur. And it's quite likely that, for example, friendship with Corinth happened earlier than with quite a few places in between. But if there was one state which really made a difference to Sparta's standing in the Peloponnese, it was probably Elis. And I find it quite surprising how little Herodotus has to say about the role of Elis and its international sanctuary at Olympia. Of course, the Olympic Games and the sanctuary feature in the histories, but mainly as a place for elite individuals to raise their profile and make connections. Elean seers appear in prominent positions elsewhere, but not as an instrument of Elean diplomacy. In fact, Olympia provides us with the first evidence of a kind of Peloponnesian claim, when somebody, probably the Eleans, remodeled the whole sanctuary and gave a new hero shrine of Pelops a central place. This was around 600 BC. Soon afterwards, there are signs of close contacts between Sparta and the sanctuary at Olympia, with unique honors for the Lacedaemonian proxenus or diplomatic representative, but also new preference for Laconian temple decoration. Whether that reflects politics or not, there were certainly close relationships. Elis was building a territorial state in the Western Peloponnese, using alliances to secure its influence over smaller communities, and probably quite a while before the Spartans were starting to do the same. Elis also had a considerable network of connections centered on Olympia, in the Peloponnese and beyond. In the 6th century, Sparta became a particularly important contact for the Eleans. But I wouldn't bet that it was Sparta which took the initiative. In the earlier 6th century, Elis seems to be the prime networker in the peninsula, although the evidence we get from Olympia may well skew the picture rather a lot. Still, if any single state had a pivotal role in Sparta's network early on, it's almost certainly Elis, a state that is really just on the sidelines in Herodotus' histories. Now, we finally get more details about Sparta's foreign policy in the late 6th century. Here, most of Herodotus' narrative is linked to the reign of Cleomenes I. Herodotus' Cleomenes is a colorful character. He plots against his colleague, the other king Damaratus, and ultimately against the Lacedaemonian state. He meets a rather gruesome end. At the same time, Herodotus also builds up a picture of relationships and conflicts between Greek states, which will shape his narrative of the Hellenic alliance against the Persian invasion of 480. Individual details are often rather dubious, but the overall picture is that of Spartan foreign policy as this complex network of friendships and animosities I've already mentioned. Herodotus takes it for granted that diplomacy often relied on personal relationships, and his Spartans clearly rely on the connections of prominent citizens, and especially the two royal families. It is also clear that involvement in the affairs of other states often meant intervention to help specific friends in internal conflicts. In this context, military power is not a means to coerce states into the alliance. It can be used to weaken enemies, as happened to Argos, or to make friends by supporting them against their enemies. The prospect of backup from a powerful friends seems to be the main incentive for states or for individuals to be on friendly terms with the Spartans. An impressive network of relationships is built in this way. I do not have the time to discuss all this in detail here, because there are lots of little detailed problems with this narrative. But I want to finish with the two crucial passages for the early Peloponnesian League. And this is these are really the two passages that have given rise to ideas about how the Peloponnesian League was actually organized in the late 6th century. Now, Herodotus first presents the agreement with Tegea as the origin story of Sparta's alliance building. But of course, the League is more than just a set of alliances. It needs some kind of setup that gives it at least some organizational framework. Two further episodes then seem to show exactly that. And so what we actually get is the idea of a league constitution in the 6th century. The background for both these passages is the chaotic aftermath of the fall of the Pisistrid tyranny in Athens, and Cleomenes' attempts to influence the regime that would replace it. Let's be clear, unlike the Tegean story, Herodotus did not write these two episodes to inform us about the setup of the Peloponnesian League, but they've certainly been read this way. Now, the first is set just after Cleomenes' reforms that had been enacted, perhaps around 506. Cleomenes had first helped to oust the Pisistrid tyrant, Hippias, and an earlier attempt to influence developments in Athens had been met with resistance. So then he tries again. He leads an allied army across the isthmus in order to establish Cleomenes' rival Isagoras as the tyrant. But the campaign fails. The allied troops reach Eleusis when the allies finally find out what the aim of the campaign is. At this point, the Corinthians decide that this was not a cause they wanted to support, and the troops withdrew. Cleomenes' colleague, Demaratus, also disagreed, and so the campaign dissolved without achieving its goals. This describes an allied Peloponnesian campaign, the earliest in the historical record. But a lot of the details don't add up. The most striking feature is that the allies come all the way to Eleusis without knowing what the plan was. What did they think they were doing? De Saint Croix connected this with the well-known Peloponnesian alliance clause that the allies would follow the Lacedaemonians wherever they would lead. If you take the phrase literally, we would imagine a scenario where the Peloponnesian army, which is called up and might enter Attica without understanding the aim of the campaign. The idea of this kind of secrecy is really unrealistic and also pretty dangerous. What you don't want is an allied army in enemy territory suddenly finding that it really doesn't fancy the campaign after all. And this is exactly the story we are getting here. At least part of this story is shaped by Athenian concerns. It forms part of the foundation story of the democracy. In it, the Athenian people are shown as capable to defend their newfound freedoms. First by forcing Cleomenes from the Acropolis, and then by defending themselves against the concerted attack of Peloponnesians, Boeotians, and Chalcidians. The Peloponnesian attack was defeated because in the end, everyone except Cleomenes recognized that its aim to restore tyranny to Athens was wrong. The Athenians themselves managed to defeat the Boeotians and the Chalcidians on the same day, taking hundreds of prisoners. So a pretty legendary record of success here. Now, Herodotus tells us that the prisoners were later ransomed. and their chains were still displayed on the Acropolis, hanging on the wall, damaged by the fire in the Persian wars. There was also a victory monument on the Acropolis. And I really would love to know what period on the Acropolis these observations reflect. But in any case, we do have specific monuments that go with these stories. And that's no wonder, really. This event confirms the strength of the Athenian demos and its ability to stand up to serious challenges. Herodotus concludes that equality, or isegoria, and freedom, eleutheria, strengthened Athenians' military capability. Now, what's also interesting is that while the Athenians fought Boeotians and Chalcidians, this story is nevertheless presented as part of the long series of Dorian invasions into Attica. This particular framing of the story only makes sense once incursions into Attica by allied Peloponnesians became a factor in Athenian lives. This first happened in the 440s, but it is tempting to think of the early 420s instead, when annual Peloponnesian expeditions really changed Athenian lives for long periods, and for the worse, of course. Following this experience, it seems likely that any Spartan attempt at an incursion would be remembered as a campaign of the Spartans and their allies, no matter what the composition of the invasion force of 506 had. On the same story is firmly focused on the disagreement between the kings. Here, the episode serves as an explanation why two kings were no longer allowed to be on campaign at the same time. If Damaratus had just reacted to the allies' decision to depart, such a change of law would rather seem like an overreaction. So how exactly was this story actually being told in Sparta? Apart from the Athenian and the Spartan angle, this episode also serves Herodotus to emphasize the contrast between freedom and tyranny. Cleomenes is not just trying to help his friend Isagoras, he wants to make him a tyrant. This is where the Corinthians come in. In this passage, Herodotus merely tells us that they considered the campaign unjust and leave. But just 16 chapters later, the Corinthians are given the role of implacable opponents of tyranny. We can see how skillfully this episode adapts Athenian memories about the beginning of the democracy, and how well it combines that with important concerns of Herodotus' histories more generally, especially these ideas about freedom and tyranny. So the shape of the army from the whole of the Peloponnese is distinctly secondary in this story, and almost certainly shaped by the experience of later incursions. But all this means that this passage is unlikely to give us much useful information about the organization of Spartan alliances or allied campaigns in the late 6th century. So the second passage then deals with very similar themes, but it also raises the stakes. Sometime later, the Spartans try to get involved in Athenian affairs yet again. This time, they want to restore the Pisistrates tyranny to Athens, despite having played an important role in getting rid of them in the first place. So Hippias, the deposed Pisistrates tyrant, is invited to come to Sparta, and he attends a meeting of the allies who are there to discuss the planned campaign. The Spartans give a speech pointing out that the Athenians had not been showing them any gratitude for removing the tyrants in the first place, and were now gaining too much power. And the whole story, as you can also see in the passage on the screen, is actually put in this context. That the Spartans are sort of almost looking forward to the 5th century situation, and are worried about Athenian power. So the Spartans are arguing for this ploy, but then the Corinthian delegate, Socles, gets up and gives a long speech on tyranny. He sets out what the Corinthians went through under their own tyrants, and explains that based on this bitter experience, Corinth was implacably opposed to tyranny in principle. Hippias gets a speech too, but fails to convince the other allies, who agree with Corinth. the campaign never happens. This episode is the earliest example of a potential Council of Sparta's Peloponnesian League. This is how it had been read traditionally by Larsen and Sönkler, who had a big influence on how this story is still being told in most mainstream accounts of Peloponnesian history. Sparta, therefore, in that version, has learned to consult its allies before going on campaign, in order to avoid disagreements in the field that they just experienced before. And so we have a new institution, a League Council, as a result, turning the Peloponnesian League into a proper multi-state organization. But how credible is this whole episode, really? The whole aim of the campaign doesn't seem plausible in the first place. Removing the Pisistratids could be seen as an achievement, especially in a world where tyranny was rapidly going out of fashion. Even if Sparta's intervention had not brought about a regime that was particularly friendly to Sparta, because the wrong people had ended up being in charge, restoring the Pisistratids really seemed like a very odd response. And why would Hippias go along with it after having been ousted by the Spartans? If we see this episode in its literary context, it makes a lot more sense. The passage does not only frame the important logos of the Corinthian tyrants Cypselus and Periander, it also contrives a situation where the Corinthians can relate this story in the presence of Hippias, the last Athenian tyrant. And so you can actually even have a debate about tyranny presented by these different parties. The passage provides a dramatic setting for these speeches and really a discussion about tyranny and freedom and the best way of governing a state. And these are important concerns of Herodotus throughout his work. Because the allies then reject the campaign plan, the debate makes no impact on the historical events within the narrative. So really Herodotus is quite free to shape this debate as he likes, really. And so I see no reason to consider this episode as more historical than the famous Persian constitutional debate in Book 3. And I think that really is the closest parallel to it. So here are three major Herodotian passages, which have long provided the main framework for what we are supposed to think about the beginnings of the Peloponnesian League. They seem to tell a story of a first alliance with Tegea, the earliest allied campaign, and the first League Council. And here I am suggesting that all these three passages really can't be trusted as historical evidence. Because they're really all shaped by concerns of Herodotus and his contemporaries in Athens, Sparta, and some other places too. In this case, Tegea and possibly Corinth. Because of this 5th century dimension, they all give the impression of interstate relations which are much closer to the situation after the mid-5th century, or perhaps even in the early stages of the Peloponnesian War. It is therefore not surprising that historians looking for the most advanced political features in Herodotus found these passages attractive and ended up creating an image of the 6th century Peloponnesian League that is rather more advanced than we should assume. So in the end, all this is a reminder to cast the net rather wider than the main historical narratives. Now that I'm working my way through the 5th century, I find myself coming back to Herodotus rather more than I expected, and use some of his perspectives on his own time to weigh it off against whatever Thucydides is telling us, for example. But at the same time, learning to distrust Herodotus more, or rather learning to respect him much more as an excellent author who really shapes his narrative in very intelligent ways, but not necessarily in ways that make for the most factual narrative. I mean, by respecting him as an author like that, I think I've also almost been forced to look at various other types of evidence. And if one really starts looking carefully, they are actually out there. So it is actually almost respecting Herodotus more, but also trying to get him out of the way of looking at other evidence. And this is really how I'm hoping to shape my whole work on the Peloponnesian League. So thank you very much for listening.